So, I'd like to know who among you, as an introductory question, is happy with democracy in his or her country? Raise your hand. Are you happy with democracy in your country, the way it goes, the way it works? Satisfied or not satisfied? There's no right or wrong answer, but I see only a few hands being raised. So that is unfortunately the case with many citizens today. According to surveys, somewhere between 60 to 80% of citizens in different countries feel that democracy isn't going well. So that's representative democracy as we know it. And I wanted to start with this because that is, for me, the background in which we should think about lobbying and how to do lobbying and how to be effective in your different venues and your different contexts to influence whatever authorities that you are dealing with. The downside to that already negative statistic is that about a third of citizens now think that we should have new forms of governance. Not democracy, but other ways of governing ourselves. Now, that is obviously because the traditional way with representation is felt as not being sufficient. But I think that is a fig leaf which hides another tree, which is that of indirect representation through lobby groups. So when we think of representative democracy, we think of the fact that we elect representatives, but we also unofficially let representatives, i.e. lobby groups, do the representation for us to the elected representatives. So there's a real issue, and these surveys on lobbying show that people are extremely dissatisfied with interest groups, with the way their interests are being represented in the private sector to the public authorities. And the public authorities themselves see lobbying as increasingly intransparent, and while they think they need it, they see the lobbying as being a problem in democracy itself. So we have an issue with lobbying. So I'm not going to be able today to give you an exact crash course into how to be an effective lobbyist in the old school way. I will give you some tips, I will give you some key elements of how to build a strategy, and we'll have an exercise later when you can try and apply this. In any case, you've already been given the key tip, the key insight from the previous speaker in 3 words: it's know your audience. If you start from there and you think it through, you've already done 90% of the job, or you've done 90% of my job today. But so what I'm going to do is try and give you a bit of context about how to contextualize, how to think about lobbying in your different venues, also understanding that you all have very different jobs, all have very different contexts. And also to contextualize it in this context of an evolving democracy, of citizen dissatisfaction, of people wanting to be empowered in their workplace and in democracy in general. We've had some polls, and thank you to all those who have answered it. But just to help me a little bit more, who at the moment has lobbying projects underway? Who is involved in lobbying? If you could raise your hand again, a little bit of gymnastic. Why are you raising it so low? It's like you seem embarrassed. So it's really quite a few. Who will have lobbying to do in the near future? A few more? Okay. So it's clearly not a majority. So that helps me perhaps try to adapt, and bear with me with this improvisation. I will be less focused on how to lobby the EU institutions to get your projects approved or to change a regulation, which apparently will not concern most of you, to a broader definition of advocacy. Lobbying is, if you want to be precise academically, it's the targeting of public authorities to obtain a public decision in your favor, presumably, or opposing a decision that you're against. So it's targeting specifically public authorities to get a decision from them, okay? Bearing in mind that the definition of power is the ability to effect change, and those who have public authority are the ones who have the power to take decisions. So that's the first circle, that's lobbying. I will take a broader definition here, which is advocacy, which is the ways and means by which you can persuade others to see your cause favorably, okay? So it's not just public authorities, it's a wider set of targets, and it's not just obtaining a positive decision from a public authority, it's, favoring your cause more generally. So in order to explore this, I would first like to introduce a concept, and I hope you'll be able to see this. But anyway, I'll explain it. So we're moving from an idea of power, which I will call old power, to an idea of power which I will call, and this is not just me, but whatever, new power. So in the old conception, let's say 19th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, in old power you have a very centric mode of decision making, hierarchical, based on expertise, aiming at stability. In computing, we use the term big design up front. So focused on expertise that lays out plans that allow you to define clear objectives and a plan to meet them. So this approach is increasingly leaving citizens and different players frustrated, also in the workplace. And it's seeding, and it's coexisting today with another form of power, which we can call new power, where the distribution of power is much more widespread. So it's a distributed form of governance, where collaboration as opposed to top-down decision-making is valued, where the expertise is not seen as limited to a small group of people, but where people expect collective intelligence, participation, sharing of ideas. And where the authority is meant not to come from a hierarchical structure, but from affiliation of people wanting to follow and wanting to be convinced and wanting to share their affiliation, which is more volatile. And again, these two worlds today coexist. As citizens, as consumers, as working in the workplace, we're getting more and more used to challenging authority, to expressing our opinion, to taking part in various ways, to choices and decision making. And today we see different forms of power coexisting, and we haven't yet, whether in the workplace or in democracy, in our institutional system, we haven't yet fully worked out how to make these different forms of power coexist and evolve to new forms of decision making. So to take an example, we'll try and structure this with your examples. These underpinning these systems are a set of values that I laid out. So in the new, you have informed, distributed. I should have written them down earlier, but I'll repeat. Collaboration focused, not a few number, but a diversity of forms of expertise. Something I didn't mention earlier, this approach values transparency as opposed to a more centric hierarchical, top-down, expertise-focused, and more discretion, if not secrecy, prone. So old power in these two visions is more like a currency you hold and you don't share. And the more currency you have, the more attention you get from lobbyists, advocates of different causes who want to obtain something from you. So I'll symbolize this with a euro. This is the currency model. In the new power form vision or way of living it, it's a bit more like a flow, like a river, or like electricity, where your role when you have power in that format, in that approach, is not so much to keep it, but to distribute it and to channel it. If you're the person or the organization that channels power in that approach, you have power. But you don't hold it. You don't keep it to yourself. You don't try to maximize it. To make this more concrete, can you think of examples of people who have, this will be probably the easiest, an old power conception of, an old power approach to their organization and these values? You don't have to quote your employer immediately. If that's what springs to mind, but I don't know if that's the case. But who could we think of in that approach? Andrea? Don't follow, run ahead. Yes? So interesting. Because Donald Trump, I would put in this category. He uses old power. He's the president of the United States, right? But he relies on values that are new. So look at his use of Twitter. Now, he's not just here, right? Other examples? Here I would also put Cinque Stelle. Okay, they originally say we're going to consult people, etc. So the values, the language, etc. is new world, new power type. But the way they conduct, as far as I know, I'm not Italian and we can dispute these categorizations, but the way they conduct their business, etc., and now in power, is very much old power, I believe. Other examples? Macron. So, where would you put Macron? Same as Trump. Not, sorry? Not as blunt as Trump. So it's interesting because Macron, I think, has moved. So definitely during the campaign, adopting the language and the campaign itself, very much like Obama in 2008, being based on a flow of partisans mobilizing, giving them authority, giving them the power to self-organize, etc. So both the structure and the values were here, but indeed now he's here, right? And his movement is feeling a lot of tension because disappointed. So I think you can put Obama here as well. Putin here, okay? Any dispute? No? What example did I have for the other ones?
For the new, I would Podemos.
So where? New forms of power?
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit like Trump.
Yeah.
It's a traditional party seeking power in the traditional form. but with values and collaboration in some ways.
It's not so traditional.
Okay.
Maybe it would be in the middle. I don't know. Crossing.
Yeah. Well, we could be more precise. It's the point here, we could continue this, but is to make you reflect on what sort of power are you in this transition phase. You know, we usually tend to have lobbying classes in the notion that the world is still here. But that's not the case. And one has to navigate these tensions and these contradictions. And maybe yourselves want to ask yourselves, where do you stand on this 2x2? And where do you want to be? Or where do you want your organization to be? How do you want your organization to mobilize power, mobilize a community, or hoard power, etc.? So that's the first notion I wanted to introduce. The second notion I wanted to introduce, which makes all this complex, even more complex, which is probably familiar to many of you. Who's familiar with the concept, the acronym VUCA? Anyone? Yes. Did you read it?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember what the letters stand for?
No, I'm sorry. I read it before the coffee this morning.
You see, Andrea, we should have had the coffee.
Volatility.
You see. Okay. Yeah. What's the U? Yes. What's the C? Complexity. Ambiguity. It's impossible to read, okay? But we have them. So we're in a world, and every era has probably thought that it was more complicated than the previous. But admittedly, things accelerate today for lots of reasons: technology, globalization, etc. So what becomes increasingly the case in whatever environment we work in is that we have to factor in these different factors, parameters that make the work of influencing our working environment, advocacy, lobbying, or other forms, more difficult. So what does volatile mean? As you remembered the first word, what does it mean to you? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and in sometimes unexpected ways. If we look at our political context today, it's very volatile, isn't it? Citizens want to get rid of the old very quickly and in unexpected ways. Okay, so that's an example. So what can we do about this? And this, whether for lobbying or for the management of our jobs, etc. How can we adapt to this high volatility? Expect the unexpected.
Have a flexible plan.
Yeah, so I'll write this way. Flexibility, being able to be agile, prepared, updated, yeah. All this, which is easier said than done, but it's a reality. We need, before we go into any form of lobbying or trying to manage change, etc., to develop the capacity and to build in our work schedules time to observe, monitor, reflect, etc. Again, it might sound like obvious and another to-do on top of all the things we have, but that's a reality that we have to save that hour every week or whatever, however you organize yourselves. Who wants to define uncertainty. I hear voices, but no?
Unexpected risk that you may have.
Yeah.
The issues that you may find that you do not have any provision of it.
Yes. That's a bit, the way I understand your description is it's a bit more relative to volatility. You're saying, Andrea?
Certitude about the things, the messages, the interpretation.
Yes. It's the fact that volatility is very difficult to understand, but uncertainty is about the fact that you don't know what your competitor might be up to, for instance. You don't know what the next internet fashion might be, the new business model on the internet, the new social media that people will start using, etc. So there's a greater difference or a difficulty to understand the relationship between certain causes and certain effects. So they're closely related, these two concepts, but you see this in, I certainly saw this in the 4 years I just spent managing an online media, how the internet is the far west of today, but we see it in other fields where there's a constant and very difficult way change. And so what could be the answers to this? If you project yourself in your work environment, how can we adapt to that constant uncertainty? Analytical skills, yeah. I'll just write analysis.
Imagining future scenarios, for example.
Imagining, projecting into the future, yeah. Except when you did that, you know, like Soviet style every 5 years, now you have to do it constantly. Game theory. Oh, it's getting scary. Yeah, game theory. Adapting to, maybe to use another term behind this, developing the skills to adapt to complexity and understand complexity, which is, I guess, also linked to the third one. It's also linked to developing the capacity to make sense of the world by developing your monitoring and indeed analytical capacity. Complexity. What's the difference between things have always been complicated, right? But now they're complex.
They achieve something.
They achieve something.
Knowledge, for example.
Yeah? I'm not sure I understand.
Well, when you talk about ecosystems, that
Mm.
when you achieve complexity, because you are achieving somehow knowledge or information.
I see. Okay. So information or knowledge-based. That's not what I have in mind, but it's certainly important.
The lack of hierarchy.
The lack of hierarchy.
Because when there's a lack of hierarchy, things are interacting and we don't know exactly what
Who's deciding?
is deciding.
Okay.
Multiple stakeholders,
That
multiple interests, conflicting interests.
yes. So I'm running out of space here. For me, a complex decision-making system is the EU. It's not just complicated, because it has lots of bodies. It's complex. And why is it complex and not just complicated?
It's diverse. It is diverse. We have diversity.
Yes, and so what does that generate?
Many information, lots of information.
Lots of information and It works slowly, yeah?
Lots of interest, decision makers.
Yes. And all of this means that the interaction of the different parts makes it unpredictable. So your car engine is complicated, sorry, but you know where each piece fits, and you know what the outcome will be once they're in the right place. Okay? The EU is not like that. You don't know if Slovenia's internal politics evolve in one way or another. It will change the whole picture, the whole dynamics, etc. The interaction between the different pieces becomes the major factor. So that's the word I'll write here. The interconnectedness or interaction becomes a crucial element. And therefore, in order to address this, you need, here again, to develop your analytical capacity. And you need to combine different forms of expertise. In the old system, if you only have a clique of leaders and advisors, it might work for a while to some extent, but it creates a lot of inefficiency. But in a system like this, you're bound to make real mistakes. You need to diversify the expertise you tap into. You need to be in contact with various players who have different perspectives on the world. Otherwise, you don't see the full picture. You don't see things in a, and I'll use a horrible word, in a systemic way. Okay? So I'll write systemic here. And thanks, Paolo, for the extra paper. And ambiguity. Yeah. Lack of clarity. I'll write it here. Oops. So that happens, for instance, when you enter a completely new field. You don't have your bearings, and we constantly have new fields in our current world. So these are a bit the general parameters that I think are relevant for you when starting to address this concept of influencing, advocacy, and lobbying. Now, let's try and use this to understand what key lessons it might mean for you in your various influencing jobs. So the first thing we want to understand is, like the previous speaker said, whose name I forget? Arnold, okay. So he said, know your audience, know your target. So that's the first thing. You have a target, okay? If this target is a public authority, then your influence is lobbying, okay? If you have a wider set of objectives and actors who do their own influencing of this target, we'll call this advocacy. And it uses a wider set of tools. We'll get back to that. But what's important to note is this decision-making target obviously has its own needs, right? It will share its power, whether in the old or in the new form, in exchange for something. So this is what we're going to talk about. This trade between your target and yourselves. And so when we say know your target, we want to understand that there's an exchange of either currency or current between these two. And that's what you need to understand first and foremost. So you're going to have to ask yourself, or yourselves, if you're here, what are your resources? What can you trade? Are you going to mobilize a vast body of players and channel power to bear influence on your target? Are you going to trade assets with this target? You're going to have to ask what your resources are, okay? And you're going to have to ask yourself then what question in order to be influential. You have resources, there's trade, so what's the other part? See, Andrea, we should have had that coffee. Because when I'll say it, it's really obvious. Pressure. What's the question? You're here, you want to influence this organization or set of people. You have resources, you know you have expertise, you have maybe power base or whatever. We'll come back to this. What's the other part of that equation? The strategy that's in between, yeah, but it's, okay, so maybe I'm not asking it properly because it's so obvious I must be asking it wrong. What are their needs?
He has to have to get something back for them
Yes,
to trade.
but so in front of your resources are the target's needs, okay? So just dissecting, know your audience, know your target. That's what it is. It's a trade between you and them. And that's the first analysis you will need to identify. Obviously, a target is related to a goal you have from that target. I should have probably said that before, but it's obvious. You need to define your goal very precisely first. You know, are you seeking what I have stupid examples in mind. You know, is negotiating your holidays with your spouse. That's maybe not the most scientific example. Or you know, a salary increase from your boss, or different types of settings, maybe less personal. But you have a goal, then that equation is what are your resources, what are their needs, and you're going to have to adapt whatever resources you have to whatever needs the organization which has authority, and that will be the driving concept. So let's try and dissect this a bit. What can be the needs of T in today's world? Let's do a little mind map here. Yeah. Information, yeah. I didn't hear. Visibility. I heard disability, so. Evidence. Credibility. Stories to tell. Success, I guess, right? Success stories to tell. Popularity. I put them together.
He also has targets, you know.
Yeah. Sorry. Sorry, I write network.
Money for the campaign.
Money. So, okay. Okay. What, a community? one of those who raised their hands saying that they were involved in a case of lobbying or influence earlier. Could he or she or one of you volunteer to describe what's the case, and then we can dissect your target's needs? I think you did.
I did, yeah. Well, we're a lobbying association as such. We're Energy City, so
Okay.
our interest group are local and regional authorities all over Europe.
Yeah.
So the case as such depends on the political agenda or on
The case,
timing
yeah.
as well, yeah, because it's every time related to the energy transition and to the needs of cities to implement like energy efficient measures, renewables.
So if we take one case.
Well, one current case is a lot around local community energy, so making sure that more players can get on the energy market.
Mm-hmm. So who's the target there? A local municipality, for instance?
Yeah, for example.
Okay.
Well, it's local authorities, citizen cooperatives.
So should we take FARO as a potential target?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay.
We could.
And the case is, the goal is we want them to be developing more renewables?
Yeah, we
In
can say so, yeah. I mean,
just imagining, huh?
yeah, let's imagine, because maybe they're already very good in it. I'm not
Yes.
very aware of it.
So we already have quite a few sets of needs. What else could they want in this context? Strategy. What do you mean by that?
Because they may have the information,
Mm-hmm.
but and they may have an idea of what they want, but they do not still have a strategy
Yeah.
to reach their goals.
All right. How? Yeah. How to do it?
Maybe tangible results.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're not missing anything important. I don't think we're missing anything important. There's three broad clusters. So indeed, if you take a body that is in a position of authority, in order to maintain that authority, which is not necessarily always the case, that's something you might want to analyze and understand. But assuming they do, they will want to show that they are implementing things and doing things right. So whether elaborating a decision or implementing it, they will need these assets. They will need their own resources, and they will need the know-how, and they will need recognition for it. I left this one aside because I see this as a sort of meta goal. It's part of it, right? Maintaining stability, being renewed in power, etc., the way I understand it. But it's close to this, I guess. And all these needs could be broken down, right, into more specifics. What sort of community do they need? What sort of money? What sort of network, etc., do they need to implement their job? So that's the first analysis you'll need to conduct when undertaking any advocacy job. You know your spouse's needs better than the mayor of FARO's, but still, it's the same logic. Now, what assets can you bring in front of this? And I'm looking for a different color pen. Do we have one by any chance? Ah, there it is. Thank you. So, in your case, Eurocities, what assets do you have? Or maybe because it's easy for you to answer, what others think Eurocities has in terms of assets? Does it have a lot of money? Is it going to pay FARO for its solar panels? Probably not, right? It has a network, yeah. So maybe it can link to people who have money, foundations, EU authorities, whatever. What other assets does Eurocities have? Energy cities.
So we're closely working with Eurocities.
Okay, energy cities. They have success stories. I hope so. So why is that important? It's oil in the cogs. You're telling your target you can do it because we have all these examples that it works, that it had benefits, etc. What other resources does Energy Cities have?
The access to information, in any case, so all the information, evidences, know-how in general.
Yeah. I'll draw a big circle around all of this one. How can they contribute on the other fronts? Can they help the mayor gain votes? Energy cities. Yes?
Yeah, because it rises its popularity because energy or more sustainable energy cities are well seen, so it can rise popularity.
So how might energy cities do that? Because they won't be, I presume, campaigning for the mayor of FARO. It is presumably something to think about, absolutely, but to illustrate how to think about this, how might energy cities help the mayor get recognition for what's being done?
No, and it's in that line that, for example, now the political agendas of the local authorities, they have to develop their own plans, for
Mhm.
example, for climate change or for adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way to be involved with other cities
Mm-hmm.
and to exchange information.
Yeah.
And to also give visibility in terms as sustainable government, or sustainable measures applying to in network.
Okay. Well, you use different words that connect here because your Energy Cities has a network of other cities. It's listened to by EU authorities, I assume, because it has a lot of a bank of database of examples, etc. It can, I assume, interest the mayor of FARO in maybe running for this year's Energy Cities Pride of Renewable Cities and getting recognition through that, being shared in its newsletters of things going on, which in turn the mayor can use to say, hey, look, we're talking about us and the rest of Europe. Intangible soft power, perhaps, but nevertheless potentially very helpful. Now that I've been thinking in the abstract, maybe you can give us more specific
I think it's
resources.
this really, because what we do is that we connect the cities with each other because they have similar challenges. So FARO might want to meet a Spanish city or a French city or even a Danish city to see how they dealt with
Mhm.
the topic. In terms of visibility, we have a board of directors, so this is providing a certain status, let's say, to a city. So the number is limited, of course, of mayors being in the board. It's one way of giving them a say in the network and also providing them visibility at events or, especially in advocacy and lobbying work. That's one thing that I said yesterday in my intervention. that we always prefer to have the mayors as spokespersons for our policy requests instead of being a network who is asking for this. So I think if a mayor is saying it in the name of all the mayors that are behind the network, it makes the request much more credible and legitimate in the end. Yeah, and then it's I think all about showing also their results and making them visible in any type of communication activities that we can have, both online and offline in terms of events and things like this.
Okay, great. Well, that's a very helpful example. And to recapitulate, and we'll move on. First step, you want to ask yourselves, in which power world are you evolving? Second, you want to be prepared to face a very volatile, etc. context by having the adequate structure in place. And you're not the US Army here, I know, where the concept originated. But even in your work environments, in a very simple way, you need to have the time and the teams organized to prepare for the change. Third step, you will define what you want and therefore who the target is. And you will therefore define what its needs are and what resources you can bring against it. The needs of the target can be multifaceted. It's organizational, it's professional, it's at the individual level. It can therefore also be psychological. You want to understand, again, know your target. As I said, Arnaud did 90% of the job. We're just unpacking this. But this mind map, you will do by yourselves, but you need to take time doing it, because then you can do what I would call acupuncture, where you can pinpoint your needle exactly where it helps, not where it hurts, or maybe where it hurts, but then the needle helps release the power in the right place. Fifth step, you need to have an analysis of, well, I'll call it the policy cycle, because again, I was originally thinking in the context of strictly lobbying, but let's call it the decision-making cycle more generally. And you know, I was a public affairs, i.e. lobbying consultant for many years, and it's amazing how common sense, what our advice was often, and how common sense this might seem, but how often people overlook this. Why? Because in a decision-making cycle, often the point of decision-making, which is towards the end, that's where the crisis might emerge. People think, oh, we don't like that decision, and we're going to mobilize against it. And we see many examples in policymaking of this, where, well, in particular at EU level, you know, you have a long process of decision, of negotiation at EU level, and suddenly a national organization and national industry realizes that this is not in their interest, and they argue against it. I'm French at the moment. The rail strikes are in opposition to issues that were discussed, and maybe they're very legitimate. That's not the point. But the strikes are taking place about 10 years after the negotiations at EU level for liberalization of certain forms of rail transport. So maybe, and I don't, there was some protest along the line at that time, but it's at the very end that there's the most mobilization. So this is not necessarily an example of an industry or a set of stakeholders waiting till the end. They've been concerned about this for many years. But the level of intensity, you know, this is the longest ever rail strike in French history. is at a point where it's too late really to change much, unless the French government decided to go against what has been decided at EU level and by its predecessors and abandon it, which is unlikely from a political strategy perspective. So at EU level, this is very often the case, but in general, this is often the case that, you know, the crisis appears, but the forces at play were operating, you know, for a long time. So again, a very commonsensical and obvious thing to say once it's said is you need to be in advocacy mode all the time. Because in order to develop your resources, your networks, your knowledge, your credibility with that will be assets in relation to your different targets, you don't build it at the last minute, right? So that requires an approach to advocacy where this is integrated in your everyday job. So here, presumably, you all have very different needs and different objectives. But if you take a broad notion of advocacy as influencing those who have the power to make your lives better, well, yes, that's where some of us are better at networking than others. Some of us are better at publicizing their efforts and their good cases than others, etc. And some like it more than others, and some don't like it. But it's a reality that if you don't develop that treasure trove of assets in relation to your prospective needs, when the decision time comes and you haven't done that, you're in a worse position. So for instance, an energy cities, I can imagine, doesn't just lobby the mayor of FARO or the EU institutions when there's a decision-making point, but publishes reports, organizes conferences, provides helpful services to people constantly, right? And maybe you want to give examples of what you do to cultivate your bank of resources.
Well, for the, let's say, the official channels, we would reply to consultations or send letters to, well, the decision makers that we think can make a difference. Informally, we would, that's something also that I said yesterday, would work with media, send out op-eds, or organize events where we would also invite media representatives. Well, we use social media a lot. Twitter is one of our key channels to, well, listen out to the policy sphere and also to react to it with our own messages. And then, well, pretty traditional things like best practices that we would spread so that people have this evidence of what is working and what should be supported more as policymakers. So it's quite a large array of materials and channels that we use.
Does anybody else have any examples of how you're trying early on to be helpful in your different environments? So the two insights here are be helpful and be early. Anybody has any good practice or that you know of, if you don't want to seem to be bragging, but bragging is allowed. Give us good examples. No good practices.
Well, it's just, in our case, for example, from a renewable energy community and with other communities, we began, and it's the very first contact with some of the committee, the environmental committee from the EU, that actually the main member is from Barcelona, so it was easy to contact him, for example. So through his office, we're addressing different kind of issues, not only related for energy, for example, but to try to stress the rural areas, that it's a common aspect for different, a few of our communities. So the idea is to try to be helpful through those policies or those things that they're discussing. So what we aim to have is exchanging of, if they are discussing one topic, for example, that was about the plastic. So they send us, which was the report. So in order
Okay.
But this is a very initial, so we don't have any further results yet.
Okay, but you seem to be trying to be helpful and be early. Okay.
And also to be a little bit orientated, because we are more from a technical point of view. So all these process and the way this obviously we have a relation with the energy city, and we are trying to make this to construct our network.
Okay. So, having done this analysis, you can identify what's lacking in your resources and therefore who you might want to team up with over time to be helpful. It's a bit the same as, you don't want to be annoying your friends just by calling them once every 2 years when you need their screwdriver or to borrow money from them, right? That's not how you treat a relationship in everyday life. So it's the same with advocacy and influence. You have your set of stakeholders, you build alliances, you build friendships. These are people. This lobbying is not a process between, maybe someday, robots. It's a process between people. And therefore it needs to be nurtured, and your own assets may be limited, but you can complement them with others. You can also do that in the spur of a campaign. I'll always remember this example that I was witnessing when I was in my first lobbying job in the UK. And those were the days when we still had radio tapes, So these were essentially made by Japanese companies. And as blank tapes, people used them to record music and shows, etc. So there was a copyright issue. Now, the UK government wanted to introduce a tax on blank radio tapes to that effect for intellectual property rights, to redistribute it to the music industry, etc. But the Japanese tape manufacturers weren't happy about this because this was going to be a tax on their product. Now, what did they do? They couldn't go around and say, Japanese tape manufacturers are wonderful, don't impose a tax on our business. They allied with a very unlikely partner, and this was the result of our brainstorming inside the consultancy I worked for. We thought, who uses blank tapes? So teenagers, everyone, in the office, dictaphone, whatever. And then at one point we thought, well, blind people who record books, who share books recorded on tapes, who record radio programs, etc. At that point in time, it was a very important element in their daily lives. So we approached the Blind People's Trust and asked them, are you happy about this tax on blank tapes? And they were not. They were really not happy about it because this was going to be a very significant problem for them. So we put them in the front of the advocacy campaign and we helped them voice their concern. Very legitimate. Might seem cynical to you, but this was a public interest concern, but it was more receivable as, the blind people saying it than Japanese tape manufacturers. So you want to build coalitions with people who have assets that you may not have and share an interest that you both have. How much time before the next coffee? 10 minutes. So I'll introduce another notion, and if I may have more paper, which is maybe we can put it over it. So I'll skip over these 5 examples I wanted to give you of new ways of organizing power, etc., which illustrate this division. But I'll finish, if we have 10 minutes, by giving you very basic tools for you to address the first step in the exercise you will have later. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So, the first thing you want to define, having done that analysis, is what will be your overall message and positioning. Okay, so let's say your energy cities, or the Japanese tape manufacturers, or whatever interest you represent. You want to define your positioning and your approach. How are you going to go into all this? Now that you've analyzed your resources, the other party's needs, who are the needs, your goals, etc. And we'll do that on a piece of paper. I think better with a piece of paper. So your positioning is the main message and the rationale you will present. So to illustrate with the Japanese tape manufacturers, the message is not free trade with Japan and more jobs in Japan, right? That could be a message, but we don't anticipate it's going to work well. The message is freedom of creation, ability for people in needs to have an extra tool that brings added quality in their life, etc. So in order to, thank you very much. In order to get to that point of your positioning, how you position yourself, you're going to have to identify identity, what your identity is. Oh, yay. So what are your key characteristics? What defines you? And therefore, in relation to your targets, position, and needs, what you're lacking. So in this case, let's take again Japanese manufacturers, an understanding that it may not be them that should be in front first. You want to understand the context as we've analyzed, target, needs, etc. And combined with your objectives, spelling them out, you will define your messaging, your positioning, which constitutes, which is made of an overall message. So again, like the Japanese manufacturers, what you're seeking to provide, and then a rationale. Why does it matter? And usually, here you want wider benefits, not benefits to yourself, but the public interest, let's say, benefits, the collective interest. And if we have more time, we can dissect them, but the usual ones are, what can you think of? This will procure benefits to others. Of what type? I'm acting in the common interest. I'm not acting as a Japanese manufacturer for my own good. What could be these general benefits? Social? So equity, fairness. What else? So I would put a more general category, quality of life, freedom. Oops. What are the types of benefits can you claim to bring to be heard? Gender equality. Whew. Capacity building. Employment is yeah, under economy, jobs is. I was hesitating to show you a few press releases from just last week looking at different lobbies in Brussels. Almost every time you see jobs in there. Growth, yeah. absolutely. Increasingly, sustainability in a wider sense. Health. Etc. But in this process, you will want to find the right words that match this context, your identity, and your objectives. And you want to be credible afterwards, that we won't have time in the exercise to build the credibility, but you want to think what in your resources makes you credible to say this. Okay, so maybe in your storytelling in the exercise, you want to think about this. You'll be given different roles. You can imagine why and how you back it up. Okay? And then you will, from there, define your approach or your strategy. Oops. Oh, I need the coffee as well, sorry. So here, there's basically, to use that center of gravity again, let's imagine this is planet Earth, or a planet, whatever, that's your target. One approach, which we call insider lobbying, or insider whatever influence, is the one normally people tend to give priority to. It is the ability to land on that planet, to go into that authority's office and provide all the assets we've talked about, the information, the expertise, the networks, etc. So it's to be in a close relationship with that group. And when you look at different lobbying situations, those who usually have the most influence, not necessarily always, but are those who have a very close relationship with the center of authority. You have some that have close authority because they are instrumental to the issue. So for instance, if you look at DG Enterprise talking about car industry regulations, the car manufacturers have the door open. They're in regular meetings there. Then you have specialist insiders. So maybe WWF, the environment organization, might not be such an insider for DG Enterprise, but they know they need to consult them on emission standards, for instance, because they have expertise, or a health organization, for instance. And then you have some more peripheral insiders who have very occasional reason to be involved. So here, if I take my example of DG Enterprise and the car industry, I would put HEAL, which is the Health and Environment Alliance. So it's people who specialize on how pollution affects health, etc. And a bit closer, you have WWF, and really close, you have ASEA, which is the Alliance of Car Manufacturers of Europe. I think it's in French, whatever. Then you have a wider circle of outsider groups. And you have groups that are outside the closed circle of negotiation, some by choice, ideologically. We do not want to be seen as being part of this world. So sometimes this is a choice Greenpeace will make, you know. They will denounce, they will protest, they will do different types of activities. And sometimes people are outside by necessity. They want to be in, but they're rejected by, let's say here, if it's DG Enterprise, there's some groups that just don't want to listen to. And so they can be potential insiders, who would like to be in but haven't yet been invited. Now, when you define your strategy, you want to define where you want to be on these different circles, whether you want to be inside or not, for questions of positioning, whether you want to be seen as constructive or radical, and therefore also in the spirit of coalition building, who are your allies and where are they on this map as well. So a key element in all of this is you'll need to develop what's called a stakeholder map. So again, negotiating the next holidays with your spouse, the stakeholder map is easily done in your mind. You need to get your kids on board for your plan and maybe the mother-in-law. But in the case of a more complex advocacy or lobbying strategy, you want to be able to develop your own analysis to them. What are their needs? What are their resources? What is their overall message at the moment? Who might be your allies? What might be the different coalitions, etc. So a stakeholder map is an absolutely essential step in an advocacy campaign and something you need to spend quite a bit of time doing and monitoring. I'll finish maybe with a couple messages that I think are valid in any context. Lobbying is associated with very negative values of influencing and distorting and selfish interests, etc., which it can be. But therefore, it's all the more important to have some ethical approach to lobbying, to be transparent in particular about what you're doing. Again, use the image of developing relationships in your social circles. This is about social interactions. So you never want to distort facts. You'll get caught up with this. You never want to play people in non-transparent ways, etc. Again, this might seem obvious, but when people get involved in tense situations with interest at stake, I've seen it as a consultant, they tend to forget this. You want to, also something which might seem obvious, you want to think politically. When we say know your audience here, it's a social context, but it's a political context about getting reelected, about getting an advantage, etc. So you have to have that frame of mind, even if it doesn't come naturally. You can't be naive about these things. And you need to be very strong. I can imagine Energy Cities, from having seen their work, is very much in line with this. You need to be very strong in your expertise. This is most likely the strongest asset you can bring. You usually don't want to think in terms of money and think that will be your resource, whether money that you can deploy to make a lot of noise or other. Your key asset will be probably first and foremost the information you can bring, how to be helpful in that way, and the networks you can bring. So you want to cultivate those actively and have that in an ethical approach as your main dimension, to your main parameter. So trying to adapt to a very broad range of things. You'll hopefully recall these different steps that you can apply in different settings, and we'll do an exercise later to see how it works. Thank you.
Thank